What's the biggest difference between North and South Korea? Well, for one, I'd say watch their news broadcasts and take note on how they talk about their leaders. 조선민주주의인민공화국 친애하는 지도자 원수 김정은. As opposed to 이번 주 문재인 대통령은 중국에 방문했습니다. Yeah, that, and I think they have like this thing going on with conflict and something about a war, but yeah.
It's time to learn geography now!
Hey everybody, I'm your host Barbs. We have reached our next set of twin countries. The first was the Congos, the last will be the Sudans, but for now, we have reached the Koreas. Now, unless you've been living under a rock, I'm sure you may have heard something about North Korea in the past decade, as it's been in the news quite a bit. As you know, I'm half Korean with roots in South Korea, and not only that, but I'm also American, so basically, I'm the worst possible candidate in the eyes of a North Korean to speak about their country. I will try to remain as unbiased and neutral in my delivery, addressing as much information as objectively as possible based off of pure data and fact. 그래서 준비됐습니까? 그럼 시작! Dude, I really need to work on my Korean. I'm an embarrassment. Anyway, North Korea is sometimes referred to as the Hermit Kingdom, so there's always like a sense of mystery when it comes to what's inside. Fortunately, we have satellites and Google Earth. First of all, North Korea is located on the Korean Peninsula, connected to China's Liaoning and Jilin provinces, sandwiched between the Korea Bay and this sea, which, be careful what you call it. Koreans and Chinese prefer the name East Sea, whereas the Japanese call it the Sea of Japan. Keep in mind, there's also an incredibly short 17-kilometer long border with Russia at the tri-point with China. Along the border with Russia lies the Friendship Bridge, and only North Koreans and Russians are allowed to take it. With a transfer in Vladivostok, this means you could essentially go all the way to Moscow, making it one of the longest train itineraries in the world at around 9 days upon arrival. The same deal exists with China, in which there are 3 main border crossings: the Sino-Korean Friendship Bridge, the Jian-Yalu River Railway, and the New Yalu River Bridge. Each of these bridges, though, are guarded and only let in certain government-approved arrivals that have no set schedule. The country is divided into 3 types of administrative divisions: the 9 provinces, the Tukbyeol시 or special city of Ranson, as well as the capital Pyongyang, which also acts in its own entity. Pyongyang has the only international airport, Pyongyang Sunan International Airport, whereas the second largest city, Hamhung, and the third largest, Cheongjin, both on the east coast, also have respectively the next largest domestic airports. Now we reach the most controversial part, the border with South Korea. Literally like their own brothers. This 250-kilometer long border, known as the DMZ or Demilitarized Zone, also sometimes called the 38th parallel, this line was established by the Korean Armistice Agreement to serve as a buffer zone between the two nations, giving more than a little half of the peninsula to North Korea. This means that essentially both countries claim that they are the rightful owners of the entire peninsula, or at least their government ruling systems should be the dominant ruling ideologies. At Panmunjom lies the Joint Security Area, which acts as like the only connection between North and South Korea, with neutral conference rooms. It's actually kind of like a tourist spot in which people are allowed to go in under the supervision of a military guard. On top of that, it's estimated that the country has about 8,000 to 15,000 hidden underground facilities, including underground factories, underground Air Force hangars that cut through mountains, naval ports, and artillery pieces in caves. North Korea, as we will soon find out, has quite a unique layout based heavily off of politics. Here you will find symbolism and imagery that relates to the government everywhere, even in the middle of remote farm villages. Every school and office building is required to have portraits of the late Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung on their walls. In Pyongyang, when they're not driving, they usually take the amazingly embellished underground metro system, which goes as far as 110 meters below the surface. Most foreigners that visit rarely get to see anything outside of Pyongyang. If you score a deal with the government, you might be allowed to visit Cheongjin or the beaches of Wonsan or the industrial city of Hamhung. Oh, and keep in mind, since 2015, they've actually started using their own time zone, UTC plus 8:30, which makes them 30 minutes behind South Korea and Japan. Why did they do that? Because North Korea, that's why. Otherwise, this is the part where I usually mention places of interest, and honestly, out of my research, almost all of them were located in Pyongyang, such as the Korean People's Study House, the Arc of Triumph, Juche Tower, Cholima Statue, the Victorious Fatherland War Museum, Manyongdae Funfair Amusement Park, Kumsusan Memorial Palace, Gyeongjang Stadium, the largest in the world, the tallest building, Ryugyong Hotel, the Ideals of North Korean Workers' Party Monument. Otherwise, outside of Pyongyang and Myeongsan, you have the Friendship Exhibition Hall. In general, North Korea is quite different from most places you'll encounter due to the regime honoring architecture and monuments. Aside from all that though, the actual landscape has a few colorful sights to offer, which brings us to... Now, believe it or not, if you ever get the chance to see the landscape of rural North Korea, it will not disappoint you. First of all, North Korea is about 80% mountainous, with the largest ranges in the northeast being the Hamgyong and Namnim mountain chains. Now, when the two Koreas split up, the north side got the most treasured natural landmark, the highest peak on the entire Korean peninsula, Mount Baekdu. Well, part of it. China kind of got 3/4 of it. Mount Baekdu, with its caldera lake, known as Heaven Lake, is actually an active volcano with the last eruption happening in 1903, and it's considered a sacred spot to all Koreans. To the west of Baekdu is the longest river that divides the the border with China, the Amnok or Yalu River, which empties into the Bay of Korea. Nonetheless, the Taedong River is probably the most important one as it flows directly through Pyongyang. About 70% of the country is forested, about 20% is arable for farming, which employs about a quarter of the entire population. Virtually every single crop field is under government jurisdiction, as farmers must hand over a portion or quota to the state. During the 90s, widespread flooding disasters caused famine, which killed off hundreds of thousands of people. And since then, North Korea has actually decided to quadruple their potato production in many places, replacing rice since potatoes grow much faster and easier. Speaking of which, I would argue that if you really want a taste of deep, true, non-commercialized traditional Korean cuisine, then the North Koreans probably have it a little bit more locked down better than South Korea. I'm sorry, South Korea, but it's kind of true. I mean, come on. Since when the hell was cheese ramyun a thing? And even though, admittedly, they do taste kind of good, kimchi was never originally intended to be made into a burger patty. Anyway, a traditional Korean meal will usually consist of multiple banchan, which are small seasoned side dishes placed in small dishes and bowls alongside your main plate. Typical dishes I'm sure many of you have already heard of, like bulgogi, kalbi, samgyeopsal, buchingge, bibimbap, are made in restaurants, sometimes in the homes of the elite. However, most people in North Korea don't actually eat meat that much, except on public holidays or on special occasions due to the lack of access. North Koreans are also known for having the best version of my favorite food in the world, naengmyeon, ice cold starchy buckwheat noodles typically served with a half-boiled egg, thin slices of brisket, cucumber radishes, topped off with the right amount of vinegar and Korean spicy mustard. If I could go to North Korea just to try their naengmyeon, I would. Watch, I'm at customs at the airport and they're like, purpose of visit? Naengmyeon. Yeah, it's probably not gonna happen. Yo, Dennis Rodman, I need you to do me a favor. Almost all oil and petroleum is imported from China from a pipeline originating in Dadong along the border. And I think that's a good transition to start discussing the people and how and why they are the way they are. 그럼 말해봐. 물론 바보 같은 미국인. And that will be discussed too. Now, let's be honest, when you hear North Korea, immediately images of the Kim regime and marching soldiers, military personnel, but for a couple minutes, try as hard as you can to put that aside and go deeper to a level that most people in the Western world don't really tap into. What is North Korea like outside of the news? Well, first of all, the country has about 25 million people and has the most active troops per population at nearly 48 per thousand people. With the exception of a very small group of Chinese, Japanese, and Westerners that have residency status, the country is almost completely homogenous at 99.99% ethnically Korean. That was the easiest pie chart I've ever made. In addition, they also use the North Korean won as their currency, even though foreigners can't use it. They use a Type-C plug outlet and they drive on the right side of the road. Let's quickly talk about the few non-North Koreans that are allowed to live in North Korea. The only real group of ethnic minorities that have inhabited the peninsula prior to war times would be the Jegasun people, descendants of Manchurian lay monks from China that got married and settled in the area. Otherwise, modern Chinese people known as Huaqiao have been able to establish residencies in North Korea. However, since the 80s, more have repatriated back to China. Otherwise, a very small community of only a couple hundred Indians, Japanese, and yes, even about 200 Americans live in North Korea. Some of them are prisoners of war, some are defectors, but most of these people are serving in humanitarian sectors, providing things like medical and educational aid. The country has virtually no standardized immigration policy other than, will the president allow you in? Which is how these two people got in. Remember the Equatorial Guinea episode? We talked about the dictator Francisco Macias? Well, he made a deal with Kim Il-sung and sent his kids to North Korea shortly before he was assassinated. Yeah, his daughter Monique was raised alongside the regime, personally meeting Kim multiple times. She speaks fluent Korean and is alive today. She wrote a book and does speaking tours. Then you have this guy who goes by his Korean name, Chosun-il. He's the only Westerner to officially work for the regime. It took him over 10 years to gain the confidence of the government. He is head of the Korean Friendship Association and is North Korea's unofficial ambassador to the world. What's even more interesting are the North Koreans living abroad. Today there's a community of North Korean descended people in Japan known as the Zainichi Koreans. They have their own pro-Pyongyang operated schools and teach lessons in Korean with a strong pro-North Korean curriculum. In Japan. Weird, huh? Also, there's estimated to be a little more than 20,000 defectors living in South Korea. And there are quite a few living in the US as well. Remember that letter I got on Flag Friday? In North Korea, they speak, of course, Korean, but a distinct North Korean dialect, which is actually more kind of like a proper traditional way of speaking. Whereas the Korean spoken in South Korea utilizes a plethora of loanwords from English and to some extent Chinese. For example, in South Korea, juice is juice. In North Korea, 과일 단물, which translates to something like fruit sweet water. In South Korea, ice cream. In North Korea, 얼음 과자, which means something like ice sweet treat. It's kind of like how Icelandic and Faroese are closer to ancient Norse than Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian. Now, being a North Korean in North Korea is very different from being a citizen of most other places on Earth. First thing you have to know is juche. This word describes the ideology of North Korea started by its founder Kim Il-sung. Juche translates to something along the lines of self-reliance. What's interesting is that North Korea even goes by the juche year, not the Gregorian calendar. All the years start on Kim Il-sung's birthday, April 15th, 1912, making 2018 the year 106 for them. All resources follow the Sungun Manchongji policy, which gives ration priority to the military. They have the largest military budget per GDP in the world at nearly 23%. Both men and women are required to serve conscription, and with 1.2 million active, this makes North Korea the country with the fourth largest military after China, the US, and India. In elementary school, children are taught almost immediately that the enemy is the West, and specifically the USA. One of their favorite cartoons being Squirrel and Hedgehog, anthropomorphic depictions of North Koreans versus the Japanese weasels, South Korean mice, and the American wolves. And don't forget good old Russia Bear that the squirrels used to depend on for help as an ally, but he got too drunk and so they dropped him. Now I'm pretty sure you're all aware of how much restriction there is in North Korea on everyday commodities that we in the West are accustomed to, like YouTube. A list of things restricted in North Korea include overly provocative clothing, any website outside of North Korea's Kwangmyeong internet service, movies and music from the outside, Coca-Cola, anything related to or being LGBT, international travel unless you are a high-ranked official with permission from the government, domestic travel between cities unless you have a permit, magazines, hair dye, or a haircut that does not fit one of the 28 approved styles for men and women, any kind of religious literature. They did just legalize certain cell phones though. Progress! Speaking of which, North Korea is essentially an enforced atheistic state, although some would argue that it's more like a person reverence state. Although the constitution says it allows religious freedom, religion is heavily restricted and chastised. Anyone owning a piece of religious literature, proselytizing, or worshipping anywhere outside of the government-sanctioned and heavily monitored churches will be punished severely. Numbers are hard to come by since the Christian community is heavily concealed and underground, but studies show that there could be anywhere between 300,000 to 500,000 Christians residing in North Korea to this day. North Korea is a very elitist-run country. The top and most privileged people live in Pyongyang. Most people that live in the city are expected to excel in all fields of academia and the arts. Most people there play at least one instrument and have some kind of skill that can attribute to the furtherance of North Korea's cultural identity. And if the government feels like it, they will hold the Arirang Mass Games, the largest of its kind according to the Guinness Book of World Records. Here, students as young as 5 from one of the top 8 elite schools of Pyongyang participate in an extravagant, colorful performance of exquisitely choreographed acrobatics, arts, dance, and music with an amazing card mosaic wall, literally controlled by individual students flipping colored panels, creating a massive moving image. It's like a living TV and each pixel is a person. Okay, history time. If we really want to go back and discuss the entire history of the Korean Peninsula, it kind of goes like this. Jelmun and Mumun pottery period, Korean Neolithic period, Korean Bronze Age, Korean Iron Age, First Kingdom of Gojoseon was founded along with the Jin state, the Proto Three Kingdoms period, the actual Three Kingdoms period of Goguryeo, Baekje and Shilla and Balhae split up, the latter Three Kingdoms, United Dynastic period of Goryeo, Joseon and Korean Empire, World War II Japanese occupation, there's a weird provisional government thing hosted in China, and then this is where things get complicated. Basically, Russia and China supported the North, and the US and the UN with its allies for the South. The Korean War, or as the North Koreans call it, the Victorious Fatherland Liberation War, was essentially a war caused by political ideology. Basically, there are arguments on who exactly shot the first fire, but what we do know is that on Sunday, June 25th, 1950, North Korea's Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel behind artillery fire, and in 3 months pushed South Korean and American forces all the way down to Busan. Then the US and UN forces retaliated. They pushed the North Koreans all the way back up with a vicious counterattack. Finally, there was a stalemate and armistice in 1954, and the DMZ was set up, officially separating the two Koreas. Today, North Korea is in an interesting situation. If you talk to a North Korean, they will tell you, yes, anyone disrespecting leaders will be punished. Which brings us to Kim Jong-un. I feel like we kind of have to do a flowchart like we did in the Colombia episode. Can we do that, Ken?
Sure.
It all started with this guy, Kim Il-sung, father of North Korea. Kim Il-sung had 6 children from 2 wives. His oldest son, Kim Jong-il, took over after him when he passed away in 1994. The country wept. Kim Jong-il was known for being the man that essentially, against UN policies, made North Korea a nuclear state by supposedly developing nuclear warheads. He died in 2011. The country wept again. He had 6 children from 3 different women. The oldest son was supposed to inherit the nation, but apparently Kim Jong-nam was considered an embarrassment, and he lived in exile. The next oldest son, Kim Jong-chol, was deemed as not fit for the job, so that left the youngest son, Kim Jong-un, to take over the throne. Kim Jong-un was brought to power after his father's death, and in 2013, Kim Jong-un executed his aunt's husband under grounds of alleged corruption and treason. His half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, was assassinated in Kuala Lumpur. Details are still a little shady behind it. He then continued his father's work by doing a series of missile tests on Mount Mantap. So yeah, there's a lot of things going on in North Korean politics, and it only gets more interesting when we talk about their relationship to the outside world. Let's cover that now. North Korea is known for being one of the most isolated nations on Earth. However, they do actually have diplomatic missions with outside states. First of all, North Korea has made kind of interesting business ties with various African nations. They are known for being the creators of various statues like the ones in Zimbabwe, Namibia, Mozambique, even Senegal's Resistance Monument, the largest statue in Africa. Generally, they seem to have ties with nations that also have ties to communism or are still under communist governments. In the past, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam were pretty close allies. However, in the past, these states have adopted a more capitalistic substructure in their legislation, relations, which has distanced them from North Korea over the years. You would think that the USA and UK would have bad ties, but surprisingly, the UK has an embassy in North Korea. North Korea actually does have third-party agreements under the table that allows private investors to do business with them. Whenever North Korea says they're closing off to the Americans, there's always kind of like a small loophole that they kind of let slide, and by that I mean Dennis Rodman. North Korea might say that their best friends would kind of technically be China and Russia. However, China and Russia are a little weary of hanging out with them. Both countries are their largest suppliers of import and export, as well as outside communication, even though that is very restricted as well. When it comes to South Korea, though, the North has kind of like a strange I love you, but I hate everything you stand for type of relationship. These two are basically identical twins, separated at birth, raised by incredibly different foster parents. North Koreans kind of view South Koreans as American puppets that condone Western imperialist ideologies. Basically, the narrative for the North Koreans is withdraw your ties and sanctions to the Americans and we can reunify, whereas the South is like get rid of Kim Jong-un and join our system and then we can unify. In conclusion, yes, North Korea has quite a reputation around the world for being a mysterious, isolated nation of enigma, brimming with controversy and conflict, but they also have a unique story that tells us how ideology can play one of, if not one of the most important roles on how we people will live on the planet. I don't know what the future will hold for North Korea and South Korea, but let's hope that somehow, someway, peace can be the final result. 여러분 안녕하십니까? 오늘 특별한 손님을 모시고 왔습니다. 제 어머니입니다. Come on in, mom. 엄마, 자기소개 부탁합니다.
안녕하세요. 저는 폴 엄마입니다.
That's it? We've reached the last and final country of my own personal heritage, so I figured why not go out with a bang and bring my own mom on the show. You're gonna love her, and if you don't, I'll basically kill you.
It's time to learn geography.
Now! For the record, yes, my mom speaks English, and whenever she comes on screen, we'll most likely speak Konglish with each other since my Korean skill level is equivalent to a 5-year-old that got electrocuted in the brain. Nonetheless, that's okay! This episode will be a piece of chapsaltok. Let's begin. Now, if you haven't already seen the North Korea episode, I suggest you do because it covers some of the context you'll need for this episode. Anywho, first of all, South Korea makes up the bottom half of the Korean peninsula in East Asia, located between the Yellow Sea, the Gyeonggi Bay, the Jeju Strait, and the Korea Strait off Japan's Tsushima Island. And this thing, which be careful what you call it, the Chinese and Koreans call it the East Sea, whereas the Japanese and others might call it the Sea of Japan. The country is divided into 8 provinces, 6 metropolitan cities that act as their own entities, a special self-governing province, Jeju-do Island, and the capital Seoul, that has the title of Special City, acting as its own entity as well. Then you have this weird thing, Sejong, a special autonomous city. Back in 2007, the government was like, crap, we have too many people here in Seoul.
Yeah, half the country lives here. We need to move some people out.
That's actually a good idea, but how do we make them move?
Why don't we move the government buildings and make a second capital? We could also incentivize people to move in. Kind of work with Brazil.
Great! But you first. So now, technically, South Korea has 2 capitals. Back in my day, there were only 8 provinces, with Jeju-do and Seoul was the capital. 한국 왜 이렇게 복잡하게 하는 거지? South Korea owns and administers over 3,500 islands off its coast, the largest one being Jeju-do, which is kind of like the Hawaii of Korea. You know what's really strange? If South Korea was an island, it would look eerily similar to the shape of Ireland. Anyway, as we mentioned in the North Korea episode, South Korea has a border with their brothers up north at the DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone, patrolled by over 2 million people at any given moment. In addition, there are 4 known tunnels that have been built underneath the border, including what South Korea calls the third tunnel of aggression. Basically, in 1978, it went down like this. Oh, what the? Why is there a tunnel under my... Oh, no. Hey, UN, North Korea built this as an act of aggression.
No, it's a coal mine.
There's no coal here. It's all granite and igneous rock. And what about those other 3 tunnels we discovered?
Clearly, we were looking for coal in other places because it wasn't here.
Today, it's a tourist spot heavily guarded by South Korean troops. There are suspected to be possibly around 20 more tunnels, but info on that is classified. Otherwise, South Korea has 11 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, the Baekje Mounds, these Dolmen Sites, Changdeokgung Palace, Gyeongju Historic Village, Haeinsa Temple, Andonghwahae Maul, Hwasong Fortress, the Jongmyo Shrine, Namansansong Fortress City, the Royal Tombs of the Joseon Dynasty, and Bulguksa Temple. Otherwise, some other notable spots of interest might include places like Everland, Korea's largest theme park, and Lotte World, the world's largest indoor theme park, Gyeongbokgung Palace, Seoul Tower, the War Memorial, Lotte Tower, the tallest building in the peninsula and 5th in the world, the National Museum, Dongdaemun Market, Busan's Fish Market, Daegu's Arboretum, the Thermal Springs of Wonju. Mom, what's your favorite place to visit in Korea?
Maybe you can go to the Gangwon-do. Interesting place, so you can see that.
And the list goes on and on. Just like Japan, there are too many quirky, interesting, colorful sites to list. Alas, we must move on. If you go to South Korea, you'll notice that the countryside is actually very picturesque if you can get all the tacky apartment buildings out of the way from your view. First of all, cradled away in the docile Amurian plate, Japan and China take up most of the heavy earthquakes, tsunamis, and typhoons, so they don't really experience anything too crazy in terms of natural catastrophe. Around 80% of the country is mountainous. They share the same Taebaek mountain chain with North Korea. The longest river is the Nakdong that flows all the way from the mountain chain into the East Sea along Busan. They don't really have a lot of big lakes, the largest one being Chungju, artificially created by a dam. Since North Korea took Mount Paektu, South Korea's highest point switched to Mount Hallasan, a shield volcano located on Jeju Island. It last erupted over 1,000 years ago. This makes Jeju Island a unique place from the rest of Korea, with famous lava tube caves, Sunrise Peak, and the Dragon Head Coast. In Boryong, you have the famous mud flats that holds a festival every year that draws in over 2 million visitors. Bosong is famous for their tea fields. The problem is that summers are so incredibly humid and filled with mosquitoes. Mom, do you remember when I was a kid, they made me camp in the Yeongdong pine fields and it was like, oh my god, so terrible. They made me brush my teeth and like bathe in the river and the bathrooms were just holes in the ground.
Yes, I remember. I've never been there, but I heard all kind of terrible story about that.
Oh, and every year between winter and spring, they experience Hwangsa, the yellow dust season, in which dust particles from the Gobi Desert are swept up by fast winds and cover all of East China and the Koreas, sometimes even as far as Japan and parts of Russia. This is the reason why you see so many Asians wearing those surgical masks like every year. Now, in the North Korea episode, I discussed a list of notable Korean dishes. I'm not gonna do it again, but as you know, kimchi is the national dish. 그런데 우리 어머니가 김치 만드는 법을 가르쳐 주겠습니다.
첫째, 소금물에 배추를 절이고, 둘째, 절여주는 동안에 양념을 만드는데 고춧가루, 마늘, 생강 갈은 것, 그리고 설탕, 젓갈이 필요합니다. 모든 것을 잘 믹스하여 놓은 동안에 절여진 배추를 꺼내서 깨끗하게 씻고 먹기 좋은 사이즈로 잘라서 준비해 놓은 양념으로 버무려서 싱싱한 것을 먹고 싶으면 그냥 먹고 아니면은 2-3일 동안 두었다가 약간 익었을 때 먹으면 맛있습니다.
Now keep in mind there are hundreds of different types of kimchi out there, but cabbage is the most popular one. 근데 깍두기 나야 제일 좋아하는 김치예요. Mom, what's your favorite kimchi?
나는 내가 어릴 때 해주던 할머니가 해주던 백김치가 제일 좋습니다.
백김치, yeah. 고추장 안 나오는 김치네.
고춧가루 안 넣고 하얗게 똑같은 재료로 버무른데 고춧가루만 빠진 김치예요.
Ah, okay, yeah, that's a good one. Oh, and one dish that's kind of unique to South Korea as opposed to North Korea is that they kind of like to eat sannakji sometimes, live squirming octopus dipped in hot sauce. They also like to eat live spoon worms. Trust me though, that's kind of tame compared to some regions in China. Economy-wise though, South Korea is all about the tech industry. Some of their largest companies being LG, Lotte, SK Group, Daewoo, Hanjin, Kia, and the crowning glories, Samsung and Hyundai. Today, South Korea is the 5th largest export in the world with the G20's largest budget surplus. It also has the world's 8th highest medium household income, highest in Asia, and it also has the highest credit rating out of any country in East Asia. As of 2015, they achieved the title of being the world's largest shipbuilder at over 2 million in gross tonnage, about 41% of the world's total. On top of that, in 2005, they became the world's first country to fully transition into high-speed internet. South Korea takes tech very seriously, and it exudes through the people's lives every day in a very interesting way. I mean, they even have their own robot prison guard. This means we gotta take it over too. Are kind of like sponges. When they see something they like, they watch it, they observe it, they imitate it, they memorize it, they recreate it, master it, and obsess over it. This can be both a good and bad thing depending on what we're talking about. First of all, South Korea has about 51 million people and has the highest percentage of adults 25 to 34 years old that have tertiary education degrees. The country is almost completely homogenous at about 96% ethnically Korean, whereas the remaining 4% are made up of a number of foreigners, mostly being Chinese, Americans, and Vietnamese. They also use the South Korean won as their currency. They use the Type C plug outlet and they drive on the right side of the road. Now, without even really having to explain that much, I'm pretty sure you're all aware of how incredibly different South Koreans are from their brothers up north. In fact, on average, South Koreans are about 2 inches or 5 centimeters taller than the North Koreans due to their access to healthier and more diverse food options. South Korea, no surprise, speaks Korean, which is not only unique because there aren't really any languages related to it. Some might say Japanese is like a way distant cousin, but also because of the writing system. Back in the 1400s, Sejong the Great was like, dude, I'm sick of the Chinese characters. It's too hard. Can we just make new ones? So they did. Today, Hangul, or as the North Koreans call it, Choseongul, is a phonetic alphabet that is incredibly easy to learn. It literally only takes like an hour for anybody to learn it. I mean, this letter makes a n sound, and this makes an a sound, and so on. The strange thing though is that Hangul is the only writing system in the world that uses syllable clusters. So in order to write, you kind of have to smash either 2 or 3 letters into a box format that goes either 2 across and 1 at the bottom, or 3 all the way down. So for example, the word for foot is bal. So you'd have to take the B sound next to the a sound and the sound, making 발. And that's it. That's like 90% of the writing. Box smashing. The problem though is that speaking Korean is a nightmare. The grammar is all backwards. There's like subject indicators and possessive prefixes. There's 높은 말, 동갑말, 낮은 말. 엄마, 나의 한국어 수준 어때요? 어떻게 생각합니까?
뭐 이제 4살 5살 애기 수준이지.
Now, I already explained the early history of the Korean Peninsula in the North Korea episode, so check it out if you want a summary. Basically, after the Korean War, the two Koreas diverged very drastically. Essentially, unlike their brothers up north, South Korea became a democratic presidential republic, adopting a capitalistic model for their economy, with free market enterprise encouraging a competitive private sector. This did wonders for them. Today, they are classified as one of the 4 Asian tigers, along with Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan, meaning that they have grown at an economic rate over 10% annually over the past 30 years. Remember the Germany episode we talked about the Wirtschaftswunder? Yeah, they basically did the same thing. After war times, they started working really hard. Just Google Miracle on the Han River. After the war, most of the Americans left, but they still kept some army bases with soldiers in places like Gyeonggi-do, where my dad was born, and Daegu, where my mom was born. Anyway, South Korea is a place where the future is embraced, but the past is never let go of. Traditional dances like the colorful Choyeongmu and Talchum mask dances. If you're lucky to witness it, the long ribbon-spinning Pungmul dance can be seen in certain areas. Jultagi tightrope performers, and Namsadang acrobatics where people launch high from seesaws. Also, the amazing traditional raspy-voiced pansori singing has never gone out of style. Usually it's accompanied by these drums. Buk, right mom? Buk. And what is this one called?
장구.
Janggu.
Like that.
Taekwondo and Hapkido are the 2 national martial arts. No surprise, South Korea ranks #1 in the Olympics. Most Koreans at some point will probably learn at least a little bit of Taekwondo. I took it as a kid. And mom, you took it too, right? You took Taekwondo when you were younger?
Yeah, when I was in high school.
You were like the only girl in your class, right? How many boys were in your class?
Oh, 50, 60.
And what belt did you get up to?
Black.
Black belt. So yeah, basically my mom can kill your mom.
Why do I have to kill him?
Speaking of martial arts, South Korea is a conscription country with all men required to serve in the military anywhere between the ages of 18 to 35 for about 2 years. Women are allowed to volunteer too if they wish. Most Koreans still get married in the 전통 예식 traditional hanbok style wedding. And there's also a part where like the bride's family and friends have to like beat the husband's feet for some reason. Mom, why do they do that? Why do they like beat the man's feet during the wedding?
Maybe punishing him to take away from their daughter?
So they're like punishing him like, oh, it's payback for all the pain you will give me.
I don't know.
Fun side note, people usually try to avoid marrying someone with the same last name as them in South Korea. The problem is that only 3 last names make up about half of the entire population: Kim, Lee, and Park. Today numbers are a little hard to estimate, but many will say that about 1/3 of the country identifies as Christian, mostly Protestant branches, along with a sizable Buddhist community at maybe 20%, whereas the rest claim to vaguely follow ancient traditional Korean-style Confucianism, the indigenous shamanism, or no affiliation at all. In fact, after the US, South Korea sends more Christian missionaries abroad than any other country in the world. Otherwise, tradition aside, Koreans have glided ever so stealthily into the modern world. Today, South Korea has a huge esports industry, and gamers are celebrities. They can make millions. Of course, this can also lead to some problems, as some people have been known to have died by playing non-stop or actually killing people, or getting arrested for neglecting their children in favor of playing video games. Coincidentally, one where you have to raise an online virtual baby. I'm not even joking, that's a true story, look it up. Like the Japanese, Koreans love their norebangs, mojoktangs, and jjimjilbangs. However, the difference is that Koreans usually don't cover themselves with towels, they just go butt naked. I like your style. South Koreans also have disputably the highest percentage of plastic surgeries performed per capita in the world at around 20 per 1,000 residents. The most popular one, mostly for women, being the double eyelid surgery, in which they add a fold to their eyelids as it's seen as more attractive. Parents even usually give their daughters the surgery as a graduation gift. 엄마, 왜 한국 여인들은 쌍꺼풀 수술을 하는 것을 예쁘다고 생각합니까?
왜 넌 안 이쁘니?
No, I mean like kind of, but like sometimes like 내 생각은 수술한 여자 애기는 like when they come out they're gonna have like the 외꺼풀, so it's like 수술 또 계속 해야 돼요 for like every generation.
People thinking about the beauty is getting changed.
Oh, yeah, but you can't change your genetics. In terms of controversies, South Koreans usually rank in the top 10 or even 5 countries with the highest suicide rates. Honor culture is so high that sometimes it affects people that don't feel like they meet societal expectations. Students have some of the highest stress levels in the world. Many go to hagwons after school, which is like another special school. You can go to school after school for more school, and it ends at like 10 p.m. Students get like no sleep. And finally, unfortunately, sometimes Koreans can be a little discriminatory against non-Koreans. As a homogenous nation with no real minority experience prior to the 20th century, you might find shockingly racist depictions of certain people groups that everyone is just kind of comfortable with. Sometimes they even put up signs saying no foreigners. They are just starting to kind of move on from that, but it's kind of still there. Anyway, there are so many things I wish I could talk more about, like how Koreans use the Korean age system. They ask for your blood type because it's like a horoscope sign type of thing. The festivals of Chuseok and Seonnal. There's still like a surviving heir to the former emperor that exists today. Jeju Island has those diving women. Arirang is like the national song that everybody knows. K-pop and K-dramas have taken the world by storm. Usually K-dramas are accompanied with strange or horribly translated subtitles with the worst commercial interruptions. 찬미야, 당신은 사랑해. 왜 그렇게 하니? 오빠, 저는 이미 결혼해. 여러분, 보브 세게트 커피 신발을 매우 편안합니다. 오, 지금 사! Otherwise, some famous Koreans throughout history might include people like Lee Sun-shin, Kim Gu, Yu Kwan-sun, Kim Dae-jung, Ban Ki-moon, Song Chang-sik, Jo Young-nam, Lee Seung-man, Park Jung-hee, Park Ji-sung, Park Tae-wan, Kim Yoo-na. Actors like Park Bo-gum, Song Joong-ki, Kim Yoo-jung, Song Hye-kyo. Contemporary K-pop artists like H.O.T., B and Boa, Girls' Generation, Super Junior, AOA, Big Bang, 21, EXO. Tons of Americans with Korean heritage have also made the mark, like John Cho, Randall Park, Kim Jong, Victor Barbado, and the list goes on and on. South Korea went from a war-torn Shanty Peninsula to a world-renowned power player, and it all had to do with their international outreach. This brings us to our last and final section, the... South Korea has always kind of had to prove itself against not only their neighbors, but to their own brothers up north to show that they could become something great apart from the political divergence factor. First of all, South Korea has great ties to the European Union as they make up the second largest export partner. Tourism has exploded since the 80s and 90s, and many Koreans study abroad in Europe for college semesters. Japan is like their best frenemy. Although the Koreans loved watching the Japanese being deposed after World War II, it wasn't long until they had their own problems in the Korean War. After the war, the Japanese befriended the South, and since then, relations have gotten much better. Koreans admit they can't get enough of Japanese anime, J-pop, and they do like the colorful culture and cuisine as they make one of the largest groups that visit annually. The Philippines was one of the first friends that they had even before the split. They even sent their expeditionary force to help against North Korean invasions during war times. For some weird reason, if you put a Filipino and a Korean together, they just kind of like immediately click and get each other. I mean, why do you think I hired Ken?
Aw, thanks, man.
Yeah, I guess you're alright, kind of.
Does that mean I get to co-star in the Philippines episode?
Yeah, if you can actually edit the video on time and not ruin it by slacking off, yes you can. In terms of their close friends, Koreans would probably say China and kind of the US. Both countries host the largest numbers of Koreans in diaspora at around 2.5 million each, and both are the largest export partners. China kind of acts as like the mediator friend between them and North Korea, and they struggled alongside them during the Japanese Empire occupation years, in which both were required to speak Japanese and throw away their customs for like 3 decades. Like my mom's mom, my grandma. Mom, didn't you say like your mom spoke Japanese with your stepdad or something like that?
Yeah, they spoke with Japanese all the time when I was little. They were educated with Japanese when Japanese occupied Korea.
But they never spoke Japanese to you?
Because I don't know Japanese, and then they were kept secret
They kept a secret for the secret language from you?
for children's.
Kind of like what you and Dad did with me in Korean. Like, you just
Something like that.
kept
Yeah.
they had a secret language.
That's very smart.
The US played a major role during the Korean War and has a mutual defense treaty, meaning that any attack on South Korea would summon an immediate US response. Of course, the US still has military bases located in the country, which of course brings in some anti-American protests since many are kind of weary of the US presence. Nonetheless, Barack Obama is even quoted for saying that South Korea is one of the US's closest allies and greatest friends, as they have shared so much over the past 7 decades. When it comes to North Korea though, they kind of see him as like the brother that stubbornly thinks he can still make a point that was lost like 70 years ago. They want to unify, but just one man kind of stands in the way. South Koreans have been trying to sneak propaganda into North Korea by hurling DVDs and USB sticks and gifts and other such items via balloon across the border. They figure the best way to reunify is to expose North Korea to how great the outside world is. In conclusion, although millennia of kingdoms and empires have passed, much of South Korea's global story starts after the Korean War. This little peninsula has been able to create a supernova of recognition for itself in such a short amount of time. Let's hope that the future brings even more light to the world. Thank you, Mom, for helping me in this episode.
Thank you for inviting me here. I really appreciate it.
Do you really?
honor of that.
Do you really appreciate? Are you just saying that? Yeah.